Cancer Survivor Network, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar titled Rare Cancers, How to Empower Patients and Advocacy Organizations Through Collaboration. We'll be joined today by moderator Bill Dempster of 360 Public Affairs, along with our three subject matter experts, David Josephy, President of GIST Sarcoma Life Raft Group Canada, Martine Elias, Director of Access, Advocacy, and Community Relations with Myeloma Canada, and Durhane Wong Riger, President and CEO of the Canadian Organization for Rare Disorders, or CORD. The cancer survivor community knows the statistics about cancer all too well, that nearly half of all Canadians will develop cancer over the course of their lives, and that a quarter of them are forecasted to die from the disease. There are dozens of less prevalent cancer types that face significant and different challenges in terms of organization, research, and support. The prognosis for many rare cancers is improving as new treatments are developed. However, in Canada, getting access to new therapies and clinical trials is one of many challenges faced by patients in small communities, often struggling with the disease and dealing with life's myriad other challenges. Today's webinar will explore what individuals and caregivers can do, how groups can work together to pool resources and share best practices and information, and we hope to provide concrete recommendations for the broader cancer community in Canada. We'll learn more about how patients are working with each other and with the clinical and research community and health systems to improve the lives of Canadians affected by rare cancers. During the presentation, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions during an interactive question and answer session. You'll see a box on the right hand of your screen. You can type your question in there, and when we go to live questions and answers, your questions will be answered in order. For those of you who haven't attended an earlier webinar, this webinar is hosted by the Canadian Cancer Survivor Network. At CCSN, we work with patients, survivors, families, partner groups, and sponsors on collaborative action to identify and remove barriers to optional patient care. We work to ensure access to education and action opportunities and survivor reporting and healthcare decision making. Very important. And we support evidence-based research on ways to promote equal access to early diagnosis, timely treatment, and follow-up care. You can learn more about CCSN through our website, www.survivornet.ca. This webinar will be available online tomorrow. There'll be full video on YouTube, as well as slides, which will be on our SlideShare account, and links to both will be sent out to everyone registered tomorrow afternoon, and as well there'll be links right from the front page of our website. Thank you Novartis, Merck, and Janssen for their generous support of this webinar series. Now, over to you, Bill.
Thanks so much, Mona, and thanks, Matt, for setting this up, and to everyone at the Canadian Cancer Survivor Network. Including Jackie, and I think Jackie's on the line as well as a number of you who regularly come out to these things, and a few new names. So we're hoping that you'll all have some excellent questions or some comments. We would invite you to, as Mona mentioned, keep them in mind. Even as they come up, fill them in on the right side of your screen. We're going to spend about 45 minutes walking through several perspectives on some of the challenges and opportunities that the cancer community has to do something that we don't, I don't think in Canada, talk about either enough and we don't do as much as we should, and that's rare cancers. We're going to look into definitions. We're going to talk about what some of the smaller patient organizations can do to work together. So with that, let's get right started into just a quick sound check. Everyone can hear me okay? Mona, you're good? Or somebody can write in the type to answer. Everything's good? I'll keep on
talking.
I
have no questions and no problem showing.
Excellent. Thanks so much. So we're going to start off the webinar with just a couple of words from each of our panelists to explain the organizations that they represent. Then I'll walk through how the rest of the webinar will continue from there. So as Mona said earlier, our first panelist is David Josephy, President of the GIST Sarcoma Life Raft Group of Canada. Martine Elias, who many of you will know, builds lots of bridges across all different stakeholders in in the patient and health sector, has really devoted her full energy these days to Myeloma Canada as Director of Access, Advocacy, and Community Relations. And really, actually, the person I'm sitting with here in Toronto to do this webinar, Durhan Wong-Rieger, needs no introduction to many of the people on the line. President and CEO of the Canadian Organization for Rare Disorders, who is actually going to bring a lot of her experience globally dealing with this, but also what's happening in Canada in terms of rare cancers. And it'd be interesting to see, as we get into the conversation, what are some of the differences or lessons learned that rare cancer community can learn from the other rare disorders and vice versa. That's what we're going to hope to get from Durhan. So with that, I would turn it over to you, David, to give us your short blurb on what you're doing at GIST Sarcoma Life Wrap Group Canada.
Thank you, Bill. And yeah, here's my short blurb, as you put it. So our group has been around since 2000, formally since 2008, and we're now a registered charity. We have been for a few years. I should explain what GIST is. GIST, or GIST, is a rare sarcoma, although it's actually not super rare, but it's rare enough that very few doctors have heard of it, and even quite a few oncologists have never heard of it. So it's a cancer that can arise anywhere along the gastrointestinal tract. And it's a sarcoma, which is a much rarer class of cancers compared to the common cancers like breast cancer, lung cancer. Most skin cancers that you hear about are a different class of cancers called carcinomas. So sarcomas are relatively rare cancers. And so the GI tract is illustrated in the lower left-hand part of the slide. And next to it is a picture of a molecule. The molecule is the so-called KIT receptor protein. And in 1999, the big breakthrough occurred in understanding GIST when this protein and gene was recognized as being the oncogene driver of GIST. And that rapidly made it possible to develop targeted therapies. In fact, GIST was one of the first solid tumors for which effective oral targeted therapies were available, and that's really transformed management of the disease. We have, as it says on the slide, we have about 120 to 150 or so members across Canada. We are very active behind the scenes in trying to support patients with GIST. As soon as they contact us, for example, guiding them towards the relatively few physician specialists in Canada, assisting them with access to drugs, and just generally assisting them with getting on with their lives, and hoping that we can turn this disease into a chronic condition, which for many people it pretty much has become. We also, besides being active in virtual space over the internet, we also have physical, real space meetings. We bring people together. That's easiest where there's enough population density to make it possible, notably Toronto and Montreal. So we have sporadic patient gatherings in Toronto and Montreal, and just occasionally in other cities too, but we rely very heavily on the internet to make it possible to bring people together. I guess the last comment I'd make before I turn it over to the next speaker, the last comment I'd make is that I truly, passionately believe that even if we only contact one patient in a month, or even if we only have an interaction with one patient at a particular local gathering, we can make a big difference in the life of that patient, because very often we're the first contact they've ever made with a group that supports patients with GIST. When we have a gathering, typically it's the first time that patients have ever met another patient, and that's a tremendously empowering thing. Okay, I'll leave it at that for now, Bill.
Thanks so much, David. And you touched on one issue we'll get to later in terms of why rare cancers need a bit more attention, and that's the sense of isolation and the not knowing what this might be, and then has anyone else had it. And so just really fills a role there. Over to you, Martine, to talk a little bit about Myeloma Canada.
Sure, thank you very much, Bill. Myeloma is not melanoma. Quite often we get confused and people say, oh, it's melanoma. No, myeloma is a cancer of the plasma cells that are found in the bone marrow, and quite often we get lumped with blood cancers. But quite honestly, we're more of a plasma sort of immune cell cancer. And multiple myeloma is because what happens is you get multiple lesions in the bone, so basically holes that are created by the cancer, and that's why we call it multiple myeloma. So it is a rare cancer. It's fairly unknown cancer, and that's the reason why Myeloma Canada focuses on making sure that there's education and resources available for families and caregivers. Quite often patients are diagnosed late because it is a cancer that would be more prevalent in the population 60 and over, and the symptoms are fairly vague. You quite often get sort of put in the category of like you're just getting older, you're doing too much, take more rest, and bone pain, well, that's because of age. So one of the things that we focus on is making sure that awareness of the disease is high, and that we focus on physicians and general practitioners making sure they can catch the disease earlier, because we all know that in oncology, if you can actually diagnose a disease early and initiate treatment, the overall survival rates or expectancy do go up quite significantly. So that's a very important aspect of what we do, is awareness. And obviously the third pillar, which is access to therapy, we're quite lucky in the myeloma space that in the past 10 years or so, there's been about 7 or 8 drugs that have been approved for cancer, but only in the last year and a bit or so, there's been 5 drugs that have been approved by Health Canada. So you could imagine what that means from a healthcare perspective in terms of funding these drugs. We're going to have, and we are having, quite a significant amount of work in trying to convince payers to make these drugs accessible, because they're not they are not cheap, and quite honestly, they do have a huge impact on the outcome and the quality of life of patients. So that's really important for us. And our fourth pillar, which I think makes us very different from many of the other cancer organization patient groups, is our research. And it's not that other cancer groups don't foster or promote research, but we actually have a dedicated body of clinical experts from across the country, which represents about 24 Canadian centers that work together under a network. And we actually do fund through this network specific clinical trials, either for new compounds that are smaller compounds that are coming from smaller companies that are looking at ways to enter the Canadian market, or we actually look at combinations or drugs that may not have been studied by the pharmaceutical company in their typical phase 3 clinical trials. So we look at ways to Canadianize these protocols and give them to our Canadian patients. So that offers another venue for patients to get access to treatment. And the other aspect of our clinical research network that we're just launching, which is the national database or registry, so that we can measure and evaluate the research protocol from across the country and really look in depth at how our different centers are doing compared to each other, but what is the impact of these new therapies are going to have on the outcomes of patients. So we're quite excited about that.
Thanks so much, Martine. I've always been struck with the breadth, scale, and ability of Myeloma Canada to do so much, and almost a feedback loop of what you learn from all that research to learn about the new technologies that are coming down the pipe that can actually be applied later in the process. So I'm going to turn over to Durhan, who deals with so many of these groups, to tell us a little bit about CORD, and then we'll get at the issues.
Right. So CORD, thank you very, very much, first of all, for the opportunity to be part of this. And definitely, I think we recognize that rare cancers are important components of rare diseases, but they're also somewhat different from rare diseases. So you've got rare cancers are somewhat different from cancers, and then you've got rare cancers are somewhat different from the other rare diseases. CORD is the umbrella network for rare diseases. We're made up mostly of patient organizations, but we do have individual members, and we do work with a network of other stakeholders, including clinicians, researchers, as well as pharmaceutical companies and others that may be interested in terms of supporting rare diseases. But basically, we want to work through the patient organizations. So that's why groups like GIS and why groups like Myeloma Canada are so important, because they're the ones that can actually get to the patients, and they're the ones that can also make sure that the things that we're doing nationally, like national frameworks for regulatory access, like national programs in terms of funding for drugs for rare diseases or personalized medicines or more targeted specialty medicines, all of those we can help to do at the pan-Canadian national level, but then it's got to be supported by the disease groups and actually reaching down into the disease groups themselves to actually do the education and bring that support. So what we want to do is we want to do all the things that you've heard about: advance policy, improve screening, diagnosis, help to foster clinical trials, build a community support, and also support research. But obviously, we can't do this unless we've got patients that are supporting it, and we do so much better in terms of working with the patients if the patients are also organized through patient groups. So this is very important. Hopefully, we'll have a chance to talk a little bit about why a rare cancers network might be quite useful, and actually also be able to do some things that are not necessarily being done by individual cancer groups or by CORD itself.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just bring up one question for you, Durhan, before we go on to these specific issues? Have you actually helped like a rare cancer group get formed? Because one of the things when we were thinking about this this webinar, and David, you brought it up on one of the planning calls, was, you know, how do we get an office? How do we, you know, advocate for this main issue that we have now? Like, I think you've done a lot to actually bring them up, and kudos also to the Cancer Survivor Network for providing some of that background backup support, hashtags, etc., to groups like that.
Yeah, so we work directly with emerging patient organizations, and certainly that includes some of the smaller patient organizations. I mean, what you saw, you know, and you look at just with what David's doing in multiple myeloma, as Martine indicated, in most cases, all of these groups are started by patients and by family members. They're people that actually are drawn into it because they have a need. And quite frankly, in many cases, they don't know how to get off the ground. They don't necessarily have the administrative support, but even more importantly, they really get drawn into it because there's an urgent need that they're trying to address, or they're trying to do fundraising. So what we can do is help provide some of that infrastructure. We can help them in terms of everything from how do you set up a board, how do you actually communicate, what are some of the tools that you can do in terms of advocacy, who are the other people you need to connect with. And a lot of what we can also do is connect patient organizations to patient organizations. We can, in many of the forums that we do training for patient organizations, but really, as we say, the forums that we do for the training is as much in connecting the patient groups to other patient groups. Some of them that are much more advanced and can provide some help in terms of moving their agenda forward, or some that are at that same stage and they can learn from each other. So really, I think the importance of the patient organizations, as you folks have indicated, is tremendous. But obviously, everybody starts. You know, usually that very small group at a kitchen table, a parent, a patient, a small group that are really interested. And yeah, one of the things we can do at CORD is to really provide everything from what are some of the tools you can use, and also how can you participate in a broader network that can immediately bring you into some of those policy and other kinds of areas that we're trying to move forward on.
Thanks
Maybe I could I just make a comment on that? It's David here. I just wanted to agree with that. And this whole issue of getting started, the Kickstarter problem. It's a major issue, and certainly what made it possible for us was that we followed the lead of the USA group, which was earlier organized and bigger. And we also had a lot of help from some Canadian similarly oriented groups like Kidney Cancer Canada that were just a little bit ahead of us in terms of timing and organization. But without some initial input of ideas and people and money, a little bit of money, it's extremely difficult to start from scratch.
Thanks very much, David, and Durhan for weighing in on that additional support. And once again, forums like this webinar with the Canadian Cancer Survivor Network, I think we're going to see that theme continue around collaboration within Canada and externally. That's certainly what we're going to get to. So I won't spend much time explaining what we're going to discuss because you want to hear from our panelists, but we're going to give you a bit of an ABC on the definitions of what is a rare cancer. We're going to walk through several of the issues that are facing rare cancer patients and caregivers, as well as the groups. We're going to learn a little bit about some lessons from abroad, and especially from Europe and Australia, who are real leaders in this area. And then we're going to save some time at the end for Q&A. So please continue to think of your questions and type them in. We'll get to those towards the end. So back over to you, Durhan, to walk us through what is a rare cancer versus other kinds of cancer.
So the definition of a rare cancer is probably a little bit fuzzier than the definition of a rare disease. And that's because in most countries, in most jurisdictions, the definition of a rare disease was premised on the legislation that actually supported drugs for these conditions, so that governments in the US and Europe and Australia and Japan, they actually provided incentives for companies to actually develop drugs for these rare diseases, but then they had to demarcate which diseases are we going to provide those incentives for. So they came up with numbers like fewer than 1 in 2,000 or 200,000 persons affected, like in the US. In rare cancers, it isn't quite as clear, and quite frankly, it doesn't make that much difference. So what we do know is that about half of the cancers are actually covered by what they call the big four: breast cancer, colorectal cancer, lung cancer, and prostate cancer. And not surprisingly, these cancers have been able to command a great deal of research. They've been able to command a great deal of support in terms of clinics and best practices. And probably because you've got large groups of people that you can actually organize in terms of the patient advocacy, quite frankly. And we've seen huge advances in terms of survival and in terms of advancements in terms of quality of life in these four cancers. I mean, I think we're all recognizing, though, that, of course, many of these big cancers are going to become rare cancers as they're beginning to identify the differences within them in terms of genetic definitions.
Exactly. Very important point there.
Yeah. The next category here is these less common cancers. And these are ones that, for purposes of international definition, have been talked about as those that are less than or no greater than 6 per 100,000 population. So you can see that that's actually smaller than the definition of a rare disease, but these are ones that are still significant, and the ones that people may have heard about. They're also big enough, quite frankly, that you've got groups of clinicians and researchers that are interested in them, one, because they've got a significant patient population, or they can actually get access to the research for them. So they're less common cancers, but they definitely are struggling as well in terms of getting a share in terms of research and in terms of clinical expertise. And then, of course, we have the real rare cancers, which are significantly less than that 6 in 100,000. And these are the kinds of conditions that I think you folks are talking about as well. The challenge here, of course, is that because they are so rare, clinicians don't know about them. The biggest challenge for them, obviously, when we talk about a bit later, is getting access to diagnosis, getting access to specialists, and definitely not having the support in terms of research dollars. So it is not unusual that many of those cancers, as we can see, on this next slide here, this comes out of Australia, but quite frankly, it's probably a good reflection of what is, in Europe and what is in Canada, though we haven't done the research in Canada. I really want to give a shout out to Rare Cancers Australia for actually doing this research. They undertook this research as a patient group, brought it forth in terms of their parliament, and actually have been able to garner significant allocations of support and research on the basis of alone. And what you can see here is that, you know, based on the percentage, the total cancer burden and the deaths there, that obviously breast cancer, prostate cancer, and the major cancers are getting a greater share of the funding. And then what you can see is that in terms of the less common cancers, the amount of research dollars relative to the total cancer burden and relative to the deaths is significantly less. So in areas where you've got bowel cancer, prostate cancer, breast cancer, the percentage of research actually far overshadows the percentage of the total cancer budget. And probably the two go together, the same as we've seen in other diseases, right? The more you're investing in the research, the more you're able to have the specialists in terms of care, the better you're going to see in terms of survival and the better in terms of quality of life. So, and as you can see, less common cancers, as I said before, somewhat ability to actually begin to move into that research space, but definitely with the rare cancers, what we see is a total difference in terms of the amount of research dollars percentage and then the impact in terms of burden of the disease and also in terms of deaths. And that's the area we really have to focus on.
Thanks very much. Let's move on to some of the key issues that we identified for the purposes of this webinar. Maybe Martina, I'd throw it back over to you again, because you're saying that we need to build awareness of the fact that myeloma can strike people at the same time that they're also struggling with other issues. It might be osteoporosis, it might be something else, and sometimes physicians just miss it, or maybe patients do too. I don't know if you want to jump in there.
Sure. You know, as the early symptoms show up, which quite often are bone pain, anemia, and some kidney problems, a lot of the general practitioners, I mean, may have never seen a myeloma patient in their career, so they would sort of bob around and not know exactly what to do in terms of the further testing that would be required. So one of the things that I think it's important for rare cancer, and this is where maybe collaboration would play a huge role, is when you have cancers that have these kind of very vague symptoms as initial presentation, you know, is there a way that we can reach out to a larger population of general practitioners and you know, educate them about what these symptoms could lead to, and maybe further direct some patients to different types of testing that would continue or that would help the diagnosis. And, you know, I think that's really an important aspect, especially in rare cancers, because, you know, people don't know, and Durhan mentioned it, people don't know about them, and they, you know, there's not a lot of research being put behind rare cancer and diagnosis. And I think that's an important aspect of making sure that patients are diagnosed early, because as I said earlier, the earlier you're diagnosed, the earlier you can go on treatment, and the outcomes are better, as we know.
And David, the finding out about GIST or gastrointestinal tumors, that's a real challenge for you too, obviously, right?
Absolutely. In fact, it's the rule rather than the exception that GISTs are misdiagnosed. We sometimes ask people in an audience, what's the typical symptom of GIST? And it's a trick question, because the answer is there is no typical symptom. It's just a whole lot of different symptoms, all of which are associated with more common conditions. So we've often had patients who were told for years, literally years, by their doctor that they just had an ulcer or some other GI upset, and they ought to just take an antacid or you know, get more relaxation or whatever. And it's not until things get more serious that finally they do more in-depth tests like ultrasounds and CAT scans and recognize that it's really a GIST. So lack of awareness and misdiagnosis, underdiagnosis, it's a huge issue for our group and our disease.
And I would add too that the cost associated with the time it takes for a patient to be diagnosed is huge. The cost of the healthcare system.
Yeah.
I don't know if anybody's measured it, but it would be interesting to look at what that would mean.
Yeah.
And that, you know, that's a great point, and it actually bleeds into our next issue, which is about referrals and continuity of care and access to specialists. But I want to turn it over to Durhan briefly to talk about some of the new research on diagnosis that might actually help a lot more people a lot quicker, especially in terms of genomics and some of the exciting things that are happening.
So this is really exciting. Thanks, Bill. And we're really, I think, at the turning point in terms of how we're going to be doing diagnosis. You know, a few years ago, everybody was talking about full body scans. You know, we can find tumors that are hidden away, and we can do all of this if we could do, you know, a full scan. Forget that. We're now going to be talking about doing full genomic screening. And quite frankly, this is now not so far into the future, as we all know. I mean, many of these cancers are actually connected to genetic information. So imagine if you could go in, get your genome sequenced, and from that genomic sequencing, be able to identify what cancers you may be at risk for, what cancers you're actually developing. And certainly when we've got patients that have symptoms that are difficult to actually diagnose, to be able to refer them for screening and getting that information. I mean, obviously, the genomic screening is not going to give you a full diagnosis, but it will lead you in the right direction. And quite frankly, Canada is one of, if not the most advanced country in terms of not only having genomic screening laboratories and the capacity, but also the expertise and also the interest in terms of the research programs. So this is partly a gift from actually some of the rare diseases, which have been really invested in terms of genetic testing, genomic sequencing, but it's also something that the bigger diseases, you think about breast cancer, prostate cancer, lung cancer especially, where they have been drilling down to actually find out the genetic variants within those big diseases and being able then to identify even smaller and smaller subgroups of patients and being able to provide them with very, very targeted therapies. All of these will want to come into that space, but the big benefit could be in terms of our rare cancers, where we're now going to be able to move to, I think, Martine, you're talking about getting to that diagnosis so much quicker, and actually the cost is coming down significantly in terms of the capacity to do it. The more we can do it, the cheaper it's going to be. So I would say don't hold your breath, but quite frankly, Canada is right at the beginning of that evolution, and we could be one of those leading countries. So despite the fact that we're so far behind in so many other areas in terms of rare diseases, this is an area in which we could actually become one of the leaders. And actually what we want to do then is to get our specialists up to speed, we're going to get our patient communities up to speed, and get the other kinds of treatments that we need to get up to speed. But we really could, I think, see some real changes here. And I'm not talking about 25 years down the road. I'm talking about 5 years.
That's exciting.
Yeah, Durhan, could I just comment on that with regard to GIST? I certainly agree with Durhan's optimism in principle. I want to temper that by pointing out that moving these tests into routine clinical practice turns out to be very difficult, and there's a real implementation barrier there with the general medical practice. In the case of GIST, we've had available for 10 years now the ability to take biopsy samples and do genetic testing on them to categorize the subtype of GIST that a patient has. And yet we know that even today, in the U.S. and Canada, it's maybe 5% of newly diagnosed patients who get offered that testing. And one of the things we do as a group is to encourage patients to be proactive, tell them about the genetic testing, and ask them to demand that it be done, because it isn't being done routinely. So there really is a hurdle to be overcome in moving from the research phase to actual clinical implementation of these tests.
Thanks very much, David. And in fact, we've managed to go through a couple of other issues that we wanted to get into. So I don't think we need to spend too much time on access to specialists and referrals, but only because I think we should cover it in the opportunity section when we're talking about some of Canada's rare disease strategy and things like that, and the treatment pathways. I would maybe throw it back to the panel to briefly touch on, in the interest of time, some of the regulatory challenges and issues of getting some of these products authorized or even made aware of in Canada. I made brief reference to some of the stuff that Myeloma Canada does in terms of finding a treatment that's only available in X country and saying, hey, why don't you bring it to Canada? So maybe, Martine, do you want to quickly jump on that, and then we'll keep on moving?
Yes, sure. I think that what we're seeing with Health Canada, especially with rare cancer, and I can speak of multiple myeloma, is the interest in looking at patient input and patient value. We've had the opportunity to participate in a pilot input with Health Canada, which would prove to be very valuable, both from their perspective, but also for ours. When it comes to new compounds, I mean, the ability to have a research network is really critical, because that offers for smaller companies, biotech companies, developing companies, the opportunity to come here and do their studies in a much faster way with a group of clinicians that are, very knowledgeable about the disease, but there's also a connection between the centers. And the Myeloma Canada Research Network does afford us the ability to do this in terms of coordination of clinical trial. And we've had numerous conversations with Health Canada in terms of bringing new products. We have a product called Selenexor, which is developed by a small company in Boston, and they're doing their clinical program, their phase 3 trial here in Canada. So it's important to put ourselves on the map and make sure that we offer to develop companies that are developing new products the opportunity to come here and do research. One thing I do want to mention about regulatory challenges and issue, maybe not so much at Health Canada, but what we're seeing, especially in some of the newer cancer medication, sort of the immuno-oncology drugs, and I can speak specifically about multiple myeloma, is that a lot of the clinical trials are approved by the FDA and the EMEA in Europe based on phase 2 clinical trials, and Health Canada has followed suit and has approved a number of new treatments based on phase 2 data, because the results are so astonishing for patients that the science is very strong. But what we're seeing is a blockage at the payer level. And I'm going to leave it at that, because I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit more about this. So I think Health Canada is getting it, but not so much the payers.
Why don't you jump into that, or maybe
Before we
a
do
bridge
that,
with Durhan?
Yeah, let me come back to the regulatory. Martine, that's so insightful, and I think that, obviously you've worked on, in many aspects on this. We do know that Health Canada has put forth a regulatory framework for orphan drugs, really mimicking the EMA in many respects. That has been fully developed for a number of years now. We've been pushing to get it implemented. We now know that it's probably hopelessly tied up in the health accord. So quite frankly, we think that more political action at this point is not going to unhinge it. So what we want to do, and we've talked with Health Canada in terms of the regulatory folks there, who I agree with you, have really, I think, trying hard to make us, I think, visible and having the clinical trials and making us attractive in Canada to inviting researchers and companies to come in. We're hoping to put forth what we are calling the Canada's Orphan Drug Regulatory Guidance. So they've agreed that 90% of what we need to do and what's in that regulatory framework can actually be done today with the existing legislation, with the existing regulations that we have. So what we want to do is to put them together, and with the support of Health Canada and many others, we would like to put them out there, publish them, and make them available so that, as you say, researchers and others will know that Canada is, in fact, open for business. The other thing that will be really important is that we try as much as possible to harmonize what is happening right now in terms of applications at Health Canada level with the EMA and the FDA. So again, as companies are developing their submissions, whether it's at the clinical trials in or at the orphan drugs in, that the designation in, that they can use that same package of information to come into Canada and as much as possible to make sure that, it isn't an added burden to companies in order to include Canada at each step of the way. So it's really exciting. We just want to make sure that, as you say, that if we're chasing down companies, which we do also, that at least we can shove a package at them and say, see, it's really quite easy to come in.
Thanks. That is very exciting once again. We always say that there's challenges and issues, but sometimes we forget that there's some real opportunities out there. So Martine, it was almost a good segue into the payer world. And before the public payers actually make a determination that they're going to reimburse a product, it has to go through health technology assessment, as we know, and but maybe not everyone on the line does. And David, I thought that you might have some opinions on the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies of Health and the Quebec version of HTA, and what are some of the issues there for the rare cancer community in terms of those evaluations?
Thanks, Bill. And I wanted to say what tremendous leadership Durhan and Cord have shown on this file. It's really tremendous what they've been doing. I have a short comment on this, which goes under the rubric of, and I'm being a bit facetious, the threat of evidence-based medicine. Which is a bit of a joke, but it's not really a joke, because evidence-based medicine is now a very popular catchphrase. And it sounds unobjectionable. I mean, how else should you make a valid decision except based on evidence? But the problem is that evidence-based has turned into a catchphrase that insurers and governments and politicians can use as an excuse. It's really becoming, in some cases, an excuse for inaction. Because what it allows, it provides for the people making the decisions to answer a request for access to a new treatment or a drug by saying neither yes nor no, but just, we're still waiting for the evidence. And an example of that was just yesterday on the CBC News. There was a story of a young man in Toronto. It's not a cancer patient. It's an eye disease. A young man who needs a particular form of surgery, and OHIP in Ontario is refusing to pay for it. The family had to pay for it out of their pocket. And when they asked the Ministry of Health people and the Minister of Health to explain what was going on, they just said, we're still waiting for the evidence. We're still waiting for evidence. And when the bureaucrats talk about evidence, typically they're asking for large, randomized, placebo-controlled clinical trials with a certain level of statistical significance, all these criteria that may make sense for lung cancer or for breast cancer, but they're just impossible to achieve when you deal with a rare cancer. There just aren't enough patients out there to do that kind of controlled clinical trial, leading to big numbers and statistical significance. And so it's a major issue that our organization has had to deal with. Just the long period of time you have to wait before the governments even make a decision on, for example, access to a new drug. So the government waits for evidence to accumulate. Every year they wait is more money that they save, to be cynical about it, because they don't have to provide the drug, public access to the drug. And while they wait, our patients suffer. So it's really a major challenge to us, and I know Durhan and her group is helping with this, to move to a different kind of regulatory framework for rare diseases. Rare diseases can't be treated the same way as common diseases in terms of requirements for evidence to inform. We think that the decision should be informed by good clinical judgment, not necessarily by statistically valid evidence on large clinical trials.
Durhan, quickly on this one.
Okay, so let me really echo what David is saying. I'm going to give you a very interesting example that is really current, and that is we've got a drug, and I won't tell you for which cancers it is, but I really want to do a shaming in terms of T-Coder at the moment. It's a drug that came in, was a submission to T-Coder for two indications. One is a more common cancer, leukemia lymphoma. The other is for a very rare cancer, Waltham's anemia. The more common cancer actually came in with phase 3 clinical trial data. Waltham's came in with phase 2 because it was much more urgent, smaller patient population, et cetera, et cetera. T-Coder said yes to the first one and has given us at the first stage a no. And one of the reasons they did was exactly what David says: not enough research, not enough data, not enough patients in there. We don't like it. I mean, again, it's been approved by Health Canada because there was, in fact, an urgent unmet need. But they're saying we don't like the amounts. And quite frankly, they're saying that, quite interesting enough, they said the patient group did a really good job of submitting patient data, of really demonstrating the need, of showing the impact in terms of quality of life. And we think that the company, though, didn't actually have that same volume of information. So until the company goes out and does some more research and collects more data, we're not going to approve this. which really flies in the face of what it is that we're trying to do in terms of addressing the fact that, yeah, with rare cancers, we cannot wait and we cannot expect that same volume of information. So this is something we're living with. We're still waiting for the final decision by PCODA, and we're hoping that they will listen to what the patient says, that this is absolutely unfair to the rare cancer. So really exactly what you're saying, David.
Yeah. Thanks very much. So briefly on treatment pathways, I think earlier we talked about moving some of these new diagnostics into clinical practice earlier, because it's hard to change the minds or the ways of how healthcare professionals actually operate their practices. Clinical trials is one method to access the latest therapies, and in the cancer world, if you can get on a clinical trial as your next hope, that is as good as a standard of care, the gold standard that you're getting access to. And maybe I turn a little bit on this slide back over to Martin, because I know working with the myeloma group, there is no cure yet, as there is in many rare cancers, and they're always looking for that next vine to swing to. So Martin, just briefly on this slide, and then we'll keep it moving.
Yeah, sure. I think that's important here is the question of sequencing and treatment. What we've seen lately is either PCODA or some of the provinces have reimbursed or listed one drug versus another, and says you really have to choose which drug you need. And you cannot have them all because it's just going to be too expensive. It's going to break the bank. And I've heard this directly from the horse's mouth in Ontario. But the problem is that, you know, especially with rare cancer and immunotherapies, patients are going to need all the drugs. It's going to be a question of when they're going to need these drugs and in what sequence. And, you know, we don't have the answers to these questions because we haven't studied these drugs in sequence and see what the outcome is from the patient's perspective. So governments are hiding behind this and saying, well, we don't know the information, therefore we're not going to list these drugs. And they want to see information about sequencing. But the only way you can do this is by making these drugs available, studying them, and looking at the outcomes. And if you're not going to do this, then, you know, it's a catch-22. So I think that, you know, as patient organizations, this is something that we should, you know, work really hard at changing and making sure that these drugs are available for patients for when they need to. And I'm just going to stop here and let others comment as well.
The sequencing issue is certainly a very big one, with just no doubt about it.
So I think a lot of these issues that we've already come up with, and there are a couple more that we'll get to, but one of the questions I think that people want to know is what can we do about this? What's happening in terms of a national rare disease strategy, or some of the province-specific initiatives, or the network I think you alluded to earlier, Durhan. And I turn over to you. What's actually bubbling up that will actually resolve some of the issues that we've talked about already?
So some of you will know, because you've worked with us in terms of supporting a national or Canadian rare disease strategy, and this actually was put out, you know, now almost 2 years ago, and we've really had the opportunity to have the conversations across the country in it. I think there's a tremendous support. What we really need to do then is to begin to think about implementation of it. And it actually has the 5 areas that we all recognize: diagnosis, access to the right care, community support, access to the right treatments, and then research. And this is something that's certainly happening in many countries around the world. In 2019, the Europeans will actually put forth a revised platform for national strategies, and we'll have actually even more specifics in terms of how each one of these particular goals or program areas should be working. So I think we need to make sure that we keep moving forward on this. We were very pleased, I think, last year when Ontario announced that they would actually put together a working group to have an Ontario rare disease strategy. And we were even more pleased when they said we're not going to be doing additional research to create the strategy. We're going to take the core strategy and move forward with it. And we are also pleased that they've actually put together a working group. We've actually met as a working group. We've seen, you know, the background work that they're doing, and they're busy doing some of the actual scoping, et cetera. I mean, we're not expecting that they're going to kind of dump on us a whole bunch of monies in a full program, but I think we do see the importance of it. The same as, you know, we've looked at in terms of strategies elsewhere, and we know what the cancer strategy has been able to do for the big 4 cancers. I think what we want to do then is to make sure that a rare disease strategy works. I will tell you the bad news in Ontario. The bad news in Ontario is that they decided that the Ontario rare disease strategy will not include rare cancers. The rare cancers will be dealt with under Cancer Care Ontario, and we see no indication that Cancer Care Ontario is really even thinking about rare cancers. So again, it goes back to our notion that we need that network. We need to be able to push in terms of making sure that whether it's going to be in the rare disease strategy or whether it's going to be in Cancer Care Ontario, we've got to have that same focus in terms of the rare cancers. And they're only going to be able to do that if the cancers come together and as a single voice and say, here are the areas, and here's how we need to be involved.
Can you give us a quick idea, and I think I've seen this statistic, around between 1/5 and 1/4 of all rare disorders are actually rare cancers.
That's right, about 25% of rare diseases are actually rare cancers. I will say it's about 50% of the drugs that are being developed for rare diseases are being developed for rare cancers. Unfortunately, I think as David and my team have really clearly spoke to, we do not have a particular strategy for bringing and making those drugs available in Canada. And I will say that probably a little bit more than half of those rare cancer drugs actually get into Canada. So again, we don't have that same ability to function, I think, as other countries have, where actually there's more of a focus. So, yes.
So maybe another plug for the Cancer Survivor Network for next year's Rare Disease Day, which I understand is going to happen in late March.
We have 2 Rare Disease Days, and we really would love to partner with the Cancer Survivor Network. We're going to have a Rare Disease Day hopefully on the 28th of February in Ontario, where we can pick up on where the announcement for the working group, what's been the progress on the working group, and really focus on the provincial strategy. And then we will do Rare Disease Day more broadly, where going to really want to feature rare disease, profile rare diseases and rare disease organizations. It will be in Vancouver the 30th and 31st of March.
Oh, terrific. Thank you. So
maybe could I just jump in for a moment and point out that in a very positive way, I mean, in fact, rare cancers, for reasons that aren't so clear, but rare cancers have actually been in the forefront of the successful development of new targeted therapies for cancer. It's really a good news story. I mean, the new drugs coming along for rare cancers have been revolutionary in improving treatment, including GIST, in a way that really hasn't happened as much for breast and lung and colon and so on. So there's really a good news story in here if people would recognize it.
Thanks very much, David.
And quite frankly, it's exactly the same in terms of other rare diseases, right? Because in many cases, you can understand what the pathway in terms of the cause of the disease. You can actually target and develop therapies there. And because you do have a very focused patient population, you can actually do, quite easily proof of concept, and then they actually can move into other areas. So you're absolutely right that from a research perspective and development perspective, these rare diseases and rare cancers are actually paving the way in terms of innovative treatment.
So I think we've actually talked a fair amount about the need for more attention and awareness, and I have to give special shout out to April, who's on the line, noting and thanking us for bringing more attention to this as a nurse practitioner out west. So thank you, April, for that. We'll continue to do this kind of thing, and if you enjoy it, I would remind everyone on the line that this will be archived, and please share it among other people who need to learn more about this area. We also have spent a bit of time on the challenges of organization and team building, and how you can actually bring what are mainly volunteer groups together to collaborate and provide input and take part in research. And actually, maybe on that, I would just throw it back to you, David. How do you build something like that from the ground up? And then we're going to turn it over to everyone for some Q&A. So I would encourage people to get your questions ready. David, how do you build a team?
Oh, it's really difficult. It's a challenge. It's a challenge we have to keep on dealing with. One issue that certainly I'm acutely aware of is that most of the people, almost all the people who want to volunteer with the rare disease organization are either the patients or caregivers. And so they're very much preoccupied, understandably, with being a patient, with their treatment, or with being a caregiver. So as a group, there are people who have the least resources available often in terms of time and finances to get involved in a not-for-profit organization. So that's always a challenge that we have to deal with. I think there is a great unmet opportunity here for the various rare disease groups to get together and pool or coordinate resources on even on straightforward what seem like straightforward administrative tasks like staffing an office, doing accounting, doing fundraising. You know, I think, for example, of the United Way, where you have a lot of small organizations that get together and form a group and collectively do tremendous fundraising, but we haven't got any model like that really for support for rare cancers, and I think it'd be useful. Otherwise, we just have a whole lot of different groups, you know, almost crying in the wilderness, trying to get some attention. Maybe if we band together, we can have collective strength.
Well, that's a great segue to the next and final substantive slide around how collaboration might work and what can we learn from what others are doing, especially in Europe and Australia. So maybe over to you again, Durhan, and then back to the rest of the panel.
Yeah, not to belabor it. Rare Cancers Europe has been coming together probably for almost 20 years and has really formalized into a very powerful everything that we're talking about, you know, helping small groups come together, being a common voice in terms of policy and research that is needed, being able to interface with researchers and other stakeholders to actually develop new therapies, et cetera. So Rare Cancers Europe is certainly an interesting model. And quite frankly, you know, what we would love to see is that we have something like the Rare Cancers Canada can actually be a partner with Rare Cancers Europe. So they actually have extended that. Rare Cancers Australia, I love. It's been started by a husband and wife, you know, with a rare cancer, and they have actually built this from the ground up. But as I said, they have become a powerful lobby group, have done a lot of research in terms of helping to identify what are the stats around it, what are the challenges around it, and have actually now been able to, you know, really approach Parliament to actually get that kind of support going on, but it's only because they've come together. So I think there's some great models there. I do think it's a matter of the rare cancer community in Canada being able to come together. And I think as we learned in Rare Cancers Australia, it doesn't take everybody. You know, you start it and then they'll come. And the more successful you are and the more you've got a voice out there, the more people will come. So it isn't necessary that we have, you know, 100, you know, I think there are 198 rare cancers. We don't have to have them all at the table at the same time in order to get started.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. I think, you know, I think that it's something that we're missing here in Canada, and we can certainly learn from our international colleagues.
Yeah, Martine, I understand Myeloma Canada has great relationships with Myeloma UK, for example, and the US. And David, you mentioned that earlier, how much you learned from some of your counterparts. Maybe you could quickly touch on those potential resources and how you've become a resource for them.
Yes, it's certainly very helpful to be able to tie into the U.S. Life Raft Group, which is, you know, at least a 10 times bigger organization than we have and has a lot of permanent staff that we don't have. On the other hand, maybe others have had this experience too, when you're dealing with U.S. medical charities, they are so preoccupied by the U.S. specific issues, especially the crazy patchwork of insurance plans down there, that a lot of their effort is focused in ways that really aren't relevant to the Canadian situation. So from the point of view of basic research and information, they're very valuable, but there's still a huge need for Canadian context-specific organization.
And Martine?
Yeah, you know, I agree. We work very closely with Myeloma UK, and we're actually in the process of looking at how we can, you know, do clinical trials together. But this is in the world of myeloma. I'd like to see, you know, a broader a rare cancer group or coalition come together, because there's lots of issues. Durhan mentioned a lot of them. In terms of just the research itself and the funding for some of these trials and bringing compounds to be developed in some of the rare cancer, because, you know, especially with immuno-oncology, I think we're looking at treatments that are no longer going to be focused on the cancer type itself, but on the cytogenicity of the cancer. And what we're seeing is that there are markers that are, you know, prevalent in myeloma patients, that are also prevalent in other types of cancer, kidney cancer, melanoma. And so, you know, I think we're going to see treatments that are going to be more approached on the target rather than the disease. So I think we're at a miss if we're not working together.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And in the case of GIST, it turns out that the drug that was the big breakthrough for GIST, a drug called imatinib, was originally developed and is still effective for a completely apparently unrelated cancer, CML, or chronic myelogenous leukemia. So you do get these unusual pairings or combinations of rare diseases that come together simply because they share a target or a drug in common.
Thank you both. And you know what, we're running right against time, and we've managed to cover a lot of the key issues. Now, some of them, an individual slide, we could have spent an hour alone on, but I think we've touched the tops of the trees. I know I said I'd give a chance for Q's and A's, but you know, I've seen some good comments in the right, and I made reference to one about how this kind of awareness building opportunity is so important. So I would encourage everyone to continue that conversation. There'll be several opportunities in 2017 to do this. And in terms of next steps for the cancer survivor community more broadly, I've heard it loud and clear from all of you about networking and collaborating more together, and potentially in some kind of network that really does bring more specific focus onto rare cancers. And let's maybe next time look at or do a deeper dive on you know, what made rare cancers Australia and Europe really tick, and how can we actually do something like that in Canada.
Well, I will make an offer, and that is, if there is interest among the rare cancer community to consider, and it's certainly working with the Canadian Cancer Survivor Network, to actually create a rare cancer specific network. We would love to make that opportunity available at our meeting today. So we want to do a focus on individual therapies. We're really willing to do a focus on rare cancers as well. But we also would love to create a space and provide some opportunity for maybe that kind of formation, and at least the beginning of, you know, the rare cancer community coming together to talk about how to work collaboratively, whether it's forming a network at the moment or whether it's really looking at some common issues that you want to work on, et cetera. But I think we would love to see, you know, and provide that opportunity.
Excellent. So with special thanks to the Canadian Cancer Survivor Network for hosting this issue and the panel, and real thanks and appreciation to David Josephine, Martine Elias, and Durhan Wang Rieger for being our subject matter experts today, and especially to all of you on the line too. Again, we had a few comments, not the questions that we saved to the end, but let this conversation continue well into the new year, because there's a lot of work to still do. So back over to you, Mona, and thank you all for listening and taking part.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Bill. I'm very glad to have heard all of this today. I think there's, you know, I learn something every time we attend one of our own webinars. Thank again all of our panelists for joining us today. Stay tuned to our website and sign up for our e-letter for other opportunities to join our webinars. We hope to join us at Medical on Cancer Survivors. This webinar from today will be available tomorrow online, a full video on YouTube, as slides which will be available on our SlideShare account. Everyone who is registered will have links to both, which will be sent out tomorrow afternoon, and the links will be available on the front page of our website. Thank you all again for attending, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the day.